Pocahontas only lived until her 21st birthday, with many believing she died of tuberculosis or pneumonia, but her sister was there that day, and she revealed a much darker truth. On the day of her birth in 1596, the woman we know as Pocahontas actually entered the world with an entirely different name. She was born as Matoaka, which means flower between two streams, and referred to how Pocahontas was born between two rivers. Both her name and birth foreshadowed how she would be pulled between two cultures, colonist and indigenous, for the rest of her life. Pocahontas is often called a princess, but the truth is a little different. In real life, she was the favorite daughter of powerful Chief Powhatan, who oversaw a vast network of tribes in what is now modern-day Virginia. As the apple of her father's eye, Pocahontas certainly lived like his little princess. She was his delight and darling, and he loved to see her smile. Matoaka soon earned the nickname of Pocahontas, meaning playful one or mischievous one. Pocahontas had a happy childhood, and everything changed in the spring of 1607. On an April morning, 100 British colonists landed in Virginia. One of them was the famous John Smith, who is often depicted as Pocahontas's tragic love. Smith and his fellow Englishmen struggled to survive in the New World, leading Smith to change gears. In December, he sailed through the river, hoping to find people to trade with. After days on the strong river, John Smith began to explore the landscape, only to immediately become captured by Powhatan's men. They held Smith as a captive and presented him to Pocahontas' father. To Smith's surprise, the chief decided to keep him as a genteel prisoner, even welcoming the Englishmen with an enormous feast. It's at this point that Pocahontas and John Smith cross paths. Little did they know, their meeting would make history. Many people assume that John Smith and Pocahontas were star-crossed lovers. However, this might not be the case, and that's probably for a good thing. After all, when they met, John Smith was in his late 20s while Pocahontas was just 10 years old. During John's time with Pocahontas' people, the settler and the chief's daughter became fast friends. They taught each other simple parts of their respective languages, with Smith transcribing Pocahontas' Algonquian tongue and Pocahontas learning rudimentary English. But soon, the warm relationship between him and his captors changed for the worse. The tribesmen dragged out two enormous stones, then used their collective strength to seize Smith and forced him to place his head on one of the rocks. With Smith in this vulnerable position, the Powhatan people brandished their clubs and prepared to, in Smith's words, quote, beat out his brains, quote, until a stunning turn of events. Just as the Powhatan men were about to end Smith's life, Pocahontas bravely entered the fray. She ran to protect Smith, and when she couldn't save him by pleading with her father, she valiantly put her life on the line. Pocahontas threw herself over John Smith's body, so if the men wanted to harm Smith, they would have to harm her too. With this valiant gesture, Pocahontas effectively saved Smith's life. Or did she? John Smith may have never been in danger at all. Instead of trying to harm him, the Powhatans may have been trying to give him a compliment. The so-called execution may have been part of a tribal ceremony to welcome Smith into the community. When Pocahontas protected Smith, she may have just been going along with her role as Smith's sponsor. And that's not even the most jaw-dropping part about this. According to the historian Margaret Huber, Powhatan had more up his sleeve than a simple welcome to the tribe party. Instead, by bestowing an honorary position upon Smith, Chief Powhatan was playing the long game. With Smith as his ally, he could keep the British settlers under his control. This was the beginning of a long and bloody series of conflicts between the two groups. In early 1608, there was a tense peace between Powhatan and the settlers, but by April, everything changed. During the spring, one of the men from Virginia Company made a dubious trade. Chief Powhatan gave him a turkey in exchange for swords. Yes, Powhatan definitely got the better of this end of the deal, and he wanted more where their swords came from. However, John Smith had other ideas. Both men dug in their heels and began the conflict that would define Pocahontas' life. Furious that they couldn't trade for more swords, Powhatan's men began to sneak into Jamestown and steal the colony's shovels, pistols, and basically any other dangerous metal tool they could find. To no surprise, this theft angered off John Smith and his friends. The British settlers struck back by claiming 7 Powhatan men as their captives. With this, the long simmering conflict was finally reaching the breaking point. That's when Pocahontas entered the fray as a peacemaker. She negotiated between her father and John Smith. In the end, she managed to make the men back down and even got Smith to let the Powhatan captives come back home. However, the peace was incredibly brittle, and by the fall of 1608, the conflict reignited. After a brief period of peace, the dangerous feud between the settlers and the Powhatan tribe got underway. Chief Powhatan saw more and more settlers entering his traditional territories and began to suspect that these colonists weren't as accommodating as they seemed. As he later told John Smith, quote, "Your coming hither is not for trade, but to invade my people and possess my country," quote. And he was right. The settlers tried to calm Powhatan's fears by staging a fake coronation ceremony, but Powhatan was no dummy. If anything, it confirmed that the British were intent on deceiving him. As the leaves turned into colors in 1608, Powhatan made his move. He officially cut off all trade with the British. This was his trump card. By denying trades, he was effectively telling the British that they could try to survive the vicious winter on their own. It was a vicious move, and the British responded. By January of 1609, the settlers realized they couldn't survive without trade from the Powhatan. They gave the chief a cold-blooded ultimatum. When Smith met up with Chief Powhatan, he effectively told him, "You trade with us, or we declare all-out war." Obviously, this was not what Powhatan wanted to hear. From there, things devolved even further, and this conflict would have a terrifying impact on the course of Pocahontas' life. When Chief Powhatan had heard this, he struck back with two actions, one defensive and one offensive. First, he ordered his family to get out of the now dangerous territory, sending Pocahontas and her siblings to a town 50 miles away from the British. Second, based on the tides, Chief Powhatan knew the settlers wouldn't be able to sail back to their fortress. Realizing that his enemies would be captive on his lands for another night, Powhatan made a horrifying decision. He sent some of his men to kill Smith and his compatriots. However, the attack did not go according to plan. This was when a wild card entered the fray. It turns out that Pocahontas had not traveled to a faraway town. Instead, she secretly stayed near her village and overheard her father's plan to destroy the British. Cue one of Pocahontas' most famous acts. The young girl traveled to Jamestown to warn John Smith and his British comrades about her father's impending attack. Pocahontas wept as she revealed her father's plot and urged the settlers to flee if they wanted to stay alive. After a tearful goodbye, Pocahontas ran back to her people. With her help, John Smith and his men got away before Powhatan came for them. Now in 1609, Smith had a terrifying accident. While on his boat, a packet of gunpowder erupted, wounding Smith so grievously that he had no choice but to return to England and try to recover. The blast ripped one of his legs to shreds, effectively skinning his limb. As he sailed away, he thought he'd never see Pocahontas again. He was wrong, but before they reunited, Pocahontas would endure the most brutal decade of her life. For some cruel reason, Smith's fellow Brits decided not to tell Pocahontas that her friend was injured and on his way to recover back home. Instead, they heartlessly betrayed her. They walked up to the girl who supposedly saved them and told her that John Smith was 6 feet under. Along with Chief Powhatan's hatred for the British, this supposed loss led Pocahontas to stop visiting Jamestown. Instead, she began spending time with a different man. When Pocahontas was only 14 years old, she married a man named Kokum from a nearby tribe. According to Kokum's descendants, the couple had a daughter, or in some other versions, a son. Sadly, the baby wouldn't grow up knowing either of his parents. After Pocahontas and Kokum had been married for 3 years, disaster struck. While Pocahontas and her husband were enjoying their newlywed years, Chief Powhatan's trade ban was wreaking havoc on the British, and to make matters worse, he kept capturing their men and destroying their supplies with surprise attacks. Desperate and angered, the British wanted a way to get back at Powhatan. When John Smith's replacement, Samuel Argall, heard that Powhatan's beloved daughter lived at a local tribe, he came up with a plan. He decided to pay her a visit and casually make her his captive. The plan was to hold Pocahontas ransom. If Chief Powhatan wanted his daughter back, he'd need to give Argall the British men he'd abducted. It was a simple plan, but it could not have gone worse. When Argall took Pocahontas away, he told her new tribe that she'd married into that he'd bring her back soon. When the British presented their deal to Chief Powhatan, negotiations broke down almost immediately. In this tense time of uncertainty, one thing was for sure: Pocahontas was not going home anytime soon, or in fact, ever. Sadly, Pocahontas would never see her husband or her baby again. At the same time as Pocahontas walked on board Argyll's British vessel and began her return to the Jamestown settlement, Argyll's men ruthlessly killed Pocahontas' husband. Her baby survived only because the infant had already been given to a local tribeswoman. Now, British sources claim that during her years in captivity, the settlers treated Pocahontas nicely. After all, harassing Pocahontas wouldn't help end the stalemate. With his strong tribal connections, Powhatan had numbers on his side, so it would be smart for the British not to antagonize the powerful chief any further. However, not everyone agrees on this point. According to Mattaponi sources, Pocahontas may have tragically suffered a similar fate to other First Nations women by being sexually assaulted by the settlers. First Nations sources insist that multiple Englishmen assaulted young Pocahontas. When they were sated, they taunted her, saying her father wasn't agreeing to their trade because he didn't love her anymore and he wasn't interested in getting her back. These comments would obviously have stung, but they hurt even more when Pocahontas realized they had a basis in truth. You see, when Powhatan learned that the British had his daughter, he freed the Englishmen that he'd been holding captive. However, he wouldn't accept all the settlers' demands, specifically refusing to let go of his arms supplies. When Argyll and the governor of Jamestown ordered Pocahontas to negotiate with her father, she refused. Instead, there was a jaw-dropping twist. Pocahontas chose to stay with the British. Now, towards the end of her time as captive, Pocahontas converted to Christianity. Some sources say that she did so on her own free will, while other sources say that she was forced. Either way, Pocahontas received the sacrament of baptism and took on a new name as a sign of her commitment to her new faith, Lady Rebecca. With this done, she did something even more surprising. She married a settler. In April of 1614, the newly Christian Pocahontas married the settler John Rolfe. Their wedding marked the beginning of the Peace of Pocahontas, 8 calm years where the British and the Powhatans didn't fight one another. In the summer of 1616, Pocahontas entered the final phase of her short but eventful life. At that time, the Virginia Company decided to bring her and her family to England, pitching the trip as an exciting journey, and parts of it certainly were. While overseas, Pocahontas met the King and Queen of England, attended a play, and because the British pitched her as a princess, she received the royal treatment. However, according to one historian, Pocahontas's race meant that she wasn't really treated like a visiting royal. Instead, she was more like a curiosity, or even viewed as a freak. After the Virginia Company paraded Pocahontas around England, she settled down in villages like Brentford with her husband and baby. Her life was quiet at this time, but while attending a local get-together in 1617, Pocahontas encountered a face from her past, John Smith. Her reaction to seeing her friend, who she thought had perished, was heartbreaking. When Pocahontas saw John Smith, she became so distressed that she went silent and needed to be alone for a long time. Once she gathered her courage, Pocahontas confronted her old friend. She said that she had treated him well, and the settlers had promised to share with the Powhatan people. Instead, their words were lies. Now, in past decades, historians believed that the fiery confrontation between Pocahontas and John Smith meant that Pocahontas was still secretly in love with her old friend. However, the actual content of the conversation is never about romance, it's about betrayal. When Pocahontas had the chance to tell John Smith how she felt, her words don't seem very smitten. If anything, she seemed furious. In her final retort to John Smith, Pocahontas revealed that her father never believed he was truly dead. By the time the British told him that Smith had perished, Chief Powhatan had learned not to trust their words. Shortly after her tense reunion with John Smith, Pocahontas began to feel unwell. When she and her husband began the journey back to America, her illness only got worse. The ship frantically docked at Gravesend so that Wolfe could get Pocahontas on land and find a doctor to help his wife. Sadly, Rolfe's actions were in vain. No one could save Pocahontas. Pocahontas perished in March of 1617 at just 21 years of age. According to her husband Rolfe, in Pocahontas's last moments, she took comfort in her beloved son. Her last words were, quote, "All must die, but 'tis enough that her child liveth," quote. With the final sentence, Pocahontas passed on. However, with her demise, a new mystery began to take hold. To this day, No one knows exactly what caused Pocahontas' demise. Most British sources claim that she became ill with a fatal case of either tuberculosis or pneumonia. However, Mattaponi oral histories insist on a darker version of events. Pocahontas' sister was present when she passed, and according to her, Pocahontas became violently ill immediately after having dinner. She believed that Pocahontas wasn't sick, she was poisoned. Thanks for watching History Exposed. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.